Good morning, everybody. I'm really happy to see all of you here today for what seems like I think the fifth event, or anyway, a lot in this series of mini festival about video game music. We've been having a great time over the past since Thursday, and I'm really happy that we're going to be looking at some kind of critical components of what goes into keeping video games and their legacies and stuff like that around for the future this morning with today's talk. So please welcome David Gibson and Amanda May. David Gibson's with the Moving Image section, and Amanda May is with the Preservation and Reformatting division at the Library of Congress. And join me in welcoming them. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out this morning. Glad to see such a large group out for this interesting talk, I hope, about the work that we're doing at the library to process, catalog, and preserve video games. So before I start into the sort of like drier aspects of my talk, I wanted to give you guys just a brief history of video games at the library. So the library has been receiving, at least through the copyright registration process, information or registrations for video games since the late 70s. So here's the classic example I always like to bring out first, which is the copyright registration record for Pac-Man. As you'll see, it has the application title there is Puck-Man, which is the original release title. And as you'll also see, what we actually received when Pac-Man was sent in for copyright registration was a video cassette, a VHS video cassette featuring 20 minutes of gameplay and also a one-page description of the game. And that is actually also, that's still what's on the books for what is required to register your game for copyright. It just needs to be about half an hour or so video representation of gameplay and a paper description of the game. So just another example, this is the copyright record for Super Mario Brothers. Or Mario's Adventure, as it was called on its application. And again, you'll note that instead of actually receiving the game, we received identifying material, which is kind of a gray area. I actually haven't been able to locate. I think this might just be in a box in a warehouse somewhere. This identifying material. Under the supervision of top men, of course. So we're still. So we're still receiving those kinds of things. We're still receiving video representation of gameplay and descriptive material, as you will see. But in 2006, the section that I work for, the Moving Image section, took over custody of the games, essentially prior to moving to our new facility in Culpeper, Virginia, which the mission of which was supposed to be very like digital preservation focus and transfer of analog materials to digital focused. So I think the idea at the time was we'll send the video games down to Culpeper and they will just be sort of ingested in this process of digital preservation and preservation of analog materials to reformatting. So we brought over about a little under 2,000 games, 1,857 games were transferred at the time. And we are now actively receiving games at the Moving Image section under two different modes of acquisition. Copyright deposit is still a big one, but we are also starting to receive more and more private donations as word gets out that we are collecting video games. So there's a lot of gaps in the collection, obviously, because of what I showed you earlier, where we were just receiving video representation and descriptive material. There's actually a pretty large gap there for the entire 80s and most of the 90s that we don't have a lot of these games. Only around the late 90s did the library actually start getting game material, as you will soon see. So currently the collection has grown a bit. We're currently Currently, we house about 5,000 actual video games in the collection. We have about 3,000 strategy guides, 1,100 game-related periodicals, 25 gaming platforms in the collection, many of which we have bought using equipment funds, and then advertising materials. And we also do have some source code examples in our collection, because that's another thing. If you have a unique aspect or in your source code that you would like to protect for copyright reasons, you can send the excerpt from your source code, print it out to the library for copyright registration purposes. So here are some examples of some of the games that we brought over from the machine-readable reading room. They were in the Jefferson building. They were the team that were working with these games before we took over. And some of these, at least one of these, is on display in there. This InSync fantasy phone and CD-ROM game. You can actually go and visit that in our display area behind me later if you want. But most of these games, like I said, are from the late 90s, early 2000s, and they're CD-ROM games. We also have in the library plenty of strategy guides, many of which were, handsomely bound by our Bindings and Collection Care division. And we have an example of one of those also behind me that you can go check out. It's the Final Fantasy. But we have actually, since this time, we have asked that they no longer put them in these bindings, because it sort of destroys at least part of the spine, and we wanted to keep them intact if we could. So in addition to the materials that we get at the library through the copyright process, which include the two previous slides that you just saw, we're also receiving gift collections to fill in some of those gaps that I discussed. So here we see some examples of a collection from a gentleman in Alaska who sent us some Apple II floppy games. And the great thing about this collection is that he not only had the discs themselves, but he also had a lot of the packaging and a lot of the ancillary materials that came with the games, which from our perspective, since we currently can't provide access to the games themselves, it's good to have this ancillary material that will hopefully give researchers some context about the gameplay, the game situated within a historical context. Just more examples of some of the items we've received through gift collections, and some of these are also on display. This Atari, the classic notorious Atari ET cartridge. This one was not sent to the New Mexico landfill. I don't know if everybody here knows the story of the Atari game, but it basically, it was quickly made to cash in on the success of the movie, and when everyone realized that it wasn't necessarily a really great game, Atari lost a lot of money, and they had a lot of unsold copies of the game that ended up in a New Mexico landfill. And if you want to learn more about that, there's a documentary called Game Over, where a few game historians and developers visit the very landfill just to see if the urban legend is true, and indeed they do end up digging up a lot of those abandoned cartridges. So we have some other things. There's some Nintendo cartridges obviously here. This Link game, which is also on our display, is one of the games that Nintendo licensed out to Philips. So it was made for their CDI system, and it's one of the few Zelda games that wasn't made for Nintendo. And we also have, as I said, periodicals. So in 2013, two members of the game development community who happen to be friends of ours very kindly purchased from eBay full runs of Nintendo-powered GamePro, Electronic Gaming Monthly, and Game Informer. And basically they purchased it off eBay and gifted them to us, so that was very nice of them. And again, it's, I think, valuable to have these kinds of things because, we want to not only collect the games, but everything surrounding, the world of gaming and the history of gaming in America, so that we can give researchers, context beyond just being able to play or see the game. So one of my responsibilities is cataloging these materials before they're sent up to Amanda to do the actual preservation, which you will hear about very soon. And there are obviously challenges unique to video games in terms of cataloging. One of them being, you'll have one game title that's ported out to many platforms, and so it's a question of, what is the definitive version of that, if there is one at all. We have foreign language titles in the collection. We have, again, the DVDs and VHS of gameplay that I showed earlier, which, those raise their own questions. We have documentation, and we have unpublished games as well that also just raise a whole, open a whole other can of worms, basically, with those. So this is my example. This is the classic example that if you were to come to our building and get a tour, we always stop at this display and say, here are the 7, FIFA 08 soccer games we have for 7 different platforms. Again, it's something where, what are we cataloging in this case? Are we cataloging FIFA 08? Are we cataloging it, specific to each of the different platforms it's on? Because, as most of us know, it looks the same, it has the same cover and everything, but the underlying code is different, the gameplay mechanics are obviously different, and there are significant properties of each of these games that, as a cataloger, I would want to point out in a record. We also have foreign language titles, so here are just a few of the foreign language titles we've received through copyright. And again, when approaching cataloging of these, are we cataloging the foreign release? Are we cataloging what would be the English language version of this? We have, in some cases, games that were released in physical form overseas that were only released as digital downloads here. So that kind of, would give us pause in terms of how exactly we would approach cataloging those kinds of things. These are examples of some of the DVD-Rs of gameplay that we have received with accompanying material describing it. So we have Wario Land, Diner Dash, and then that Clubhouse games for the DS, right? So, and then, how do we approach these? We receive plenty of DVD-Rs in the moving image section, obviously, but, I wouldn't necessarily want to catalog these as necessarily moving image materials. They are moving image materials, obviously, but what they represent are the video games that were sent in. So I would at least want to bring that aspect of those out in a record. And here's, just an example of the source code excerpts that we've received. This one for Force Unleashed 2 for the Wii. And again, I think there is some research value into having this source code, even if it is just an excerpt. But I think there's an argument to be made that we should handle this kind of thing, like we would any other manuscript material or archival material, and that it should be housed in a way that we would house archival material. Okay, so Amanda is now going to take over and talk a little bit about her end of the of the preservation of things.
We're going to hand off a little bit. Hi, I'm Amanda May, and I work here on the Hill on the Preservation Reformatting Division. And what we do is we take a lot of items that are at risk for various reasons, like either it's a book that's falling to pieces or a newspaper that is turning brown and will fall apart when you touch it, or microfilm that is being lost, and we reformat it in some way to help preserve it. So that also goes towards all of the different CDs and floppy disks and USBs and hard drives and everything that we get as part of the collections, which we have a lot of. And so I work on that project specifically. I'm a digital conversion specialist, and I'm an archivist and technologist. So I'm working on actually trying to get the data off of these carriers and into our digital preservation platform. So talking about all the sort of things that we get. So we got different styles of floppy disks. We've got hard drives, external hard drives, internal hard drives, CDs, DVDs. We get little USB sticks. And what do you want to call those? We've got a couple different ways of naming them here: tangible media, legacy digital data storage media, external media. Usually we use one or many of these to kind of describe what we're talking about, and then we end up saying, like floppies and hard drives and stuff. So that's the sort of thing that I work with. So here at the library, we've got a lot of these things. So the machine readable collection is one. It's got about 55,000 items that I'm working on reformatting, and that's just in the first batch. So that's everything that's here on the Hill. So we've got other collections in other places, like Fort Meade. That's probably another 100,000 items. The Geography and Maps collection is at least 75,000 items, and they're really excited that we're reformatting things because then they can throw away the originals, and they're running out of shelf space. MBRS is the Motion Picture Broadcasting Recorded Sound section, and they've got the... Yeah, so they've got the video games, so that's why it's highlighted, because that's what we're talking about today. Technical reports, 5,000 items, and then a whole bunch more in all of our different archival collections, like manuscripts, folklife, veteran history, and so on. So we've got a lot of work. I've got plenty of job security. Don't worry about me. So this is our collections as you see them. So you see a box of a bunch of CDs, jewel cases in a row. I've got about 30 of those in my office right now. That's from Geography and Maps. You've got carts that come in, and these are books that have tangible media in the back of them. So if you ever had like a textbook or a test prep book or something that had a CD in the back, we get those as part of a copyright deposit. I get to work on the media that are included in those. We get archival collections. Some of these ones on the bottom, you see all kinds of different zip disks and floppy disks, and there's a box with a bunch of 5 1/4-inch floppy disks. There's even a telephone where I'm supposed to get the data off of an answering machine, and then a bunch of USB sticks that are part of the technical report section. So that's just like a little sample of everything that's in my office. I took these pictures yesterday, so I get all kinds of fun stuff. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to make a bit level copy of this data. So I'm wanting to make sure that we have an exact copy of this item. If we take a disk image, then it's a bit for bit copy. When you mount it on your computer, it's just like you had the original item and you slid it into your disk drive and it came up and it popped up and it says "tee," and you can go through the files. So it's a bit level copy, and then we describe it. We put it into our digital preservation system. We verify that it is an exact copy and that it's going to continue to be an exact copy long term. If you know anything about file hashing, we're doing hashes, and we're trying to make sure that all this stuff is going to be safe long term. And by doing this sort of bit level preservation, we are making sure that we've got hardware independence. So we don't have to maintain a 5 1/4-inch floppy drive for somebody to be able to access this data. They can pull up a digital copy and access this data just like they had the 5 1/4-inch floppy drive, but we don't have to worry about being able to source those things because they don't make those anymore. And they're kind of hard to find. An 8-inch floppy drive, we don't have one of those, so I can't even support that right now, but hopefully at some point in the future. And then when you're talking about video games, think of how many different consoles, think of how many different software items that you would need to maintain in order to be able to access the entire collection. We're trying to get rid of some of that dependence. So we've got a bunch of different interests that help come together to make these things happen. There's archivists, which I consider myself to be one, game enthusiasts and users, which I am definitely one, and then law enforcement, that's not me. But a lot of the tools that I use were developed for use in law enforcement. So if they got a suspect's computer and they need to look for whatever files are illicit on there, they've got the tools to do that. And I use those tools for less sinister purposes. So some of those tools, you'll see my Fred is my big computer at the top. His name is Fred, and his little buddy Fernando is down at the bottom. And Fred actually is the name that he came with, Forensic Recovery of Evidence Device, FRED. And Fernando is a nano Fred, and so that's an anagram, Fernando. So what it is, this is again developed for use in law enforcement, and what it's got is it's got a lot of support for these old types of systems. So on the top of the Fred, you've got all these old ports, and you've got a write blocking integrated system so that when you stick something like a USB drive in there, then you're not actually going to overwrite it, which would be bad. We want to make sure that we're getting the original item and not something that my computer made up and wrote to it. So the built-in write blocker is great. You've got all these removable drive bays, so I can pop out one of these little trays and put in a hard drive and then stick it back in and it mounts, and I don't have to like go digging in the guts of my computer in order to make a hard drive integrate into my computer. So these are the main computers that I use to work on these. I've also got a bunch of other hardware and software, and I'll kind of walk you through some of that. Because I've got a lot of different formats that I have to support, as you see. So this is a RIP station. It'll take about 100 CDs at a time and kind of run through them. It pops one in, puts it in the drive, loads it up, makes a disk image, pops it back out, spits it out into the cup, and then goes on to the next one. So that's a nice way of making a lot of disk images at once without me having to babysit my computer. As we said, we've got Fred. We've also got my Frankenstein, which is I've got a bunch of computers that I have taken to pieces, and I kind of use parts of them at a time, and you'll see the kind of cable that's sticking out of the top of it that plugs into whatever floppy disk controller I'm using. I've got an FC5025, which is again a floppy disk controller, and it helps me access a whole bunch of different older floppy disk formats. This is specifically for a 5 1/4 inch floppy drive. And then my Cryoflux, which is my really specific tool for accessing floppy disks of various sizes. It takes an image of the floppy disk at the magnetic flux level. Basically, it's reading the magnetic levels throughout the disk, and it makes a disk image of that. It's called the stream. And then later, I can interpret that stream into the actual formatted disk image. So I can read a copy of the disk once and then try to figure out what it was formatted at a bunch of times without having to go back over the disk again, which is really helpful, especially when a disk is really damaged. I only want to read it once, and then I can put it away and then work on that digital copy. So that can also be really helpful when I don't have any clue what the disk image is going to be formatted as. So I had a collection from the manuscript division, and I made the stream files of these, but then I couldn't figure out what they were formatted as. And after a lot of research and analysis of the stream file and all this stuff, I found out it was a WaveMate bullet. Anybody? WaveMate bullet. No. It's pre-DOS. It was around for maybe a year, and this guy had bought one and had written all of his books on it, and then nobody else had ever heard of it or used it. But all of his floppy disks were formatted in this format, so I was able to get the data off of it, but it was a research project. So the Cryoflux was really helpful with that. And this is some more about the Cryoflux. So you see it's got all kinds of bells and whistles. So then these disk images that I make, I can interpret using FTK Imager. So this is a screenshot of that. You can actually see the hex view of the files. You can see the list of the files there on the kind of middle-ish part. And then you can read those in a text format and then export the files. I've also got Forensic Toolkit, which will analyze large swaths of disk images, make lists of all of the different files, we'll export things, we'll hash them, we'll make reports. I can find PII, which is if I'm looking to make sure that a collection doesn't have any social security numbers existent in the collection, because I want to make sure that those don't get served accidentally to people. Then I can go running and run regular expressions to look for those social security numbers or credit card numbers or phone numbers or whatever I'm looking for. Sometimes we're even looking for classification markers, like if we had somebody who might have like top secret material in their collections, then I'm looking for markers that might be included. So like the words top secret put together or TS with anyways. Making sure we don't keep all that stuff in the collections. So I've got a Boneyard. This is old computers that had existed in the computer or in the library, or that people donated to me, and I either use them for parts or I try to boot them up and use the actual operating system that's on them. And I've got a bunch of tools and old drives and everything, and it's really fun. So talking specifically about the video game project, so it started out, we put out an annual call for preservation, which is where we send out a note to all the staff people in the library and saying, so what kind of preservation projects do you have in the pipeline? What do you want us to budget for and work on in the next fiscal year? And we got a call about video games, which is great. So that came to me after I had set up all this capability for dealing with these old media types. And we did a pilot where I brought in a whole bunch of my video game materials from over the years and tried to figure out what we could support. And Dave sent a bunch of his materials in various different formats, and we tried to figure out what we could support. And we came up with a good list. Mostly right now, we can support PC, Mac, computer-based games right now. We're not dealing with the console games right now because that's a whole different nugget of hardware dependence, and I can't support that right now, but I'm really hopeful in the future. But we have plenty of materials to work on with the PC and Mac type stuff. So we did the first batch, which included a lot of games from Monopoly titles and Chop Suey, which he's going to talk about in a minute. And not only are we capturing the disk images and the files and everything, but we are also capturing high-resolution images of high-resolution scans of all of the accompanying documentation. So we've got boxes and manuals and advertisements and flyers and everything that's kind of included in the box when it came in the box. We're capturing that as well. So 600 DPI TIFFs with an OCR PDF to accompany that, so to make access really useful when it comes up and we can actually serve some of this stuff. And then in the second batch, we had Blue's Clues and Curious George and a couple other things. And this is just how things are grouped on the shelf in MBRS, so it's kind of random what we get. We did have one failure. I had an Apple II disc that was Curious George Goes to the Grocery Store? I don't know. It failed. I tried. So the disc was damaged too bad. Even my Cryoflux couldn't save it, and I was very sad. But we did still capture all the accompanying documentation, so we've got that. And maybe in the future, we might be able to get a replacement. Sometimes with my other work, if we have an item that comes in and it's damaged, then we can ask for a replacement because it's new enough. But this title was from 1988, and they don't make it anymore. And there's nobody that I can call and ask. So, we're probably out of luck for that, unfortunately. So for this, as we kind of move along and we work on more items, we're able to document our process a little bit better. We're able to hone our workflow better. We're getting some new equipment to do the high-res scans of the items. So where we had a Tease Book Pro book cradle and cameras taking pictures, now we're going to have a, can't remember the name of it, but it's nicer. Capture One, Phase 1 camera setup, which is much more professional grade. So Dave's going to come back and talk about Chop Suey.
So Chop Suey is very near and dear to me after having worked on it for so long. And I wanted to bring up this example specifically because, this is a video game music event. And Chop Suey has a lot of cool music in it, and it also has a lot of connections specifically to the Washington, D.C. hardcore scene because Ian Svenonius from Nation of Ulysses and the Makeup contributed artwork to this game. Braden Canty, who's the drummer of Fugazi, did all the music for this game. And in fact, real fast, going to leave the PowerPoint to show you guys. Just, so we have some music represented today during our presentation. Whoops. Going to play you the Pickle Song from Chop Suey real fast.
It's all right. 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 All right. Got it, kids. It's alright.
If you really don't like my taste,
It's alright.
please don't let me go to waste.
It's alright.
I know I taste a little strange,
It's
but I
alright.
hope someday your taste will change.
It's alright.
If you don't like me,
It's alright.
All right, that's probably enough of it. But as you can tell, amazing video game music there. All right, so back to, let's see, where am I? Okay. So good old Chop Suey. If you don't know, it was a game made in 1995, aimed at basically like preteen girl audience, which is also makes it kind of a unique game, I think. Right, thank you. Narrated by David Sedaris. It was a very early gig for him as well. So yeah, there's all kinds of like cool people involved. It was designed by an artist named Teresa Duncan, who was great too, and she made some other games as well. Around the time that we were, starting to think about, how are we going to catalog these things? How are we going to preserve them? What steps do we need to take that are necessary? It was around the same time that the OLAC, or Online Audiovisual Catalogers group, put out their best practices for cataloging video games, which was very useful. So basically, OLAC defines 4 general characteristics that make video games unique. Platforms and formats being one. The fact that you can have different editions and expansions for games, and then the fact that there's credits and title information that is where the credits themselves are sort of unique in regards to the rest of sort of AV cataloging is concerned, and then the fact that there's all this legacy mark data that does exist for games that we now have to kind of go back and change to make sure it applies to RDA, which is Resource Description and Access, which is a newer cataloging set of rules, basically. So, here is the catalog record for Chop Suey, and you'll see, if I kind of point out to you, that there's fields that are unique to it as a video game. There's a 250 field that says it's a Macintosh CD-ROM. The 300 field, which is our usual physical description field, is slightly different because it talks about, the fact that it's a computer disk, the fact that it has a user's guide. And then again, you have these other fields that are specific to RDA that tell us it's a 2-dimensional moving image and a computer program and a computer disk and digital, so on and so forth. So when we were starting to think about, okay, well, we have to figure out how we're going to catalog these for purposes of preservation, we kind of created this decision tree here. It's a little hard to read, but it basically says, a game is selected for preservation, it needs to be sent up to PRD, but before we can do that, we have to make a record for it in our Voyager catalog. And then as soon as Amanda is done with it, she sends us back the game image itself, the image of the disk, and all the scans that she was talked about in both TIFF and PDA format. And then those are eventually, all of that stuff is ingested into our digital repository in Culpeper. And so, yeah, again, as Amanda said, we get an ISO image of the game itself. We get TIFFs and PDFAs, TIFFs for preservation and PDFAs for access purposes. So basically, all we're providing access to right now, if you were to come to our reading room and say, I'd like to see, such and such video game title, essentially what you would have access to is the scans and the images that we're capturing, not the game content itself, because that's still being treated as a preservation-only file. And just to show you specifically for Chop Suey, so this is kind of how the hierarchical structure of the cataloging works when we're ingesting it. So you have the content, which is the game content itself, the photograph of the disk, and then the scans of the packaging and the scans of the accompanying materials like booklets. And then we have to, we basically have preservation files and access files, except for in the terms of content, you'll notice it says to be determined. And then, but we have, preservation and access for all of the scans and images. So all of that basically gets put into this tree, and this like parent-child relationship is how we describe it, so that it can go into our workflow software, which is necessary to get it into our digital repository. So some of the challenges moving forward, we're still only receiving some games and not all. We actually are not receiving any digitally distributed content yet. We're really only receiving games that are sold physically in stores. The questions of what do we prioritize? So basically, right now we're prioritizing these CD-ROMs because we have a lot of them. They're on a fragile media, and they're basically, essentially simple for Amanda to work with in terms of preserving them. The lack of metadata standards, which is things like the OLAC best practices are helping us deal with. The fact that we have limited to no access to a lot of this content, and then trying to figure out how what is coming in for copyright. So are we still getting video of gameplay? If we are, what form is that taking? Is there a way for us to get that kind of stuff? And then Amanda has a few more slides, and then we will be available for questions.
Okay, so next steps is just continuing to work on the collection, and then we want to eventually be able to access these materials and make them available so that if somebody comes into the library and wants to actually play one of these games, then they can do that. So that's complicated by the copyright status of these games. All of them are new enough that they are still under copyright status, although by the time we come up with an access solution, they might be out of copyright. So we're looking into a possible on-campus only, meaning you have to be in a library building to be able to access these, probably on a locked-down library computer, so that you couldn't take a copy of it for your own. So that's what we're looking at. There's a few different solutions out there like DOSBox, which would allow us to basically emulate a DOS environment in order to be able to access a lot of these disk images. If you go onto the Internet Archive and look at their video game collection, then what they use is DOSBox that's embedded in their website. So if you go to play Oregon Trail there, then you'll notice the little code blips before the game actually starts up, and that's DOSBox initializing. So that's an option that we have used here at the library to access some DOS-based disk images, and that could be a solution moving forward. There's also a solution out there that was developed by Yale called, or developed with Yale, Emulation as a Service, or EAS, and that's a whole bunch of different specialized emulation environments that emulate different environments. Like if you needed an Apple II type environment, then they've got one of those, and you just configure it for use with this specific disk image. And whenever you want to use that disk image, then you pop up that particular emulation, and ta-da, you're done. So that's starting to be a larger solution within the library community, and we might be able to use that in the future as well. There's also virtualized access environments. Basically, you make a virtual machine that's configured specifically for this disk image, and there you go. So we're exploring a bunch of these different solutions. We don't have anything yet, but as I said, right now we're doing stuff for preservations primarily. And access is unfortunately just a secondary consideration, but I'm hopeful that in the future we'll be able to get something going, and it'll be awesome because it'll be, I might have to test all those video games and make sure they're working. Sad. So as Dave said, we're open for questions.
For those, just real fast, for those that don't know, Chop Suey has been emulated through Rhizome, which is a museum in New York, so you can play Chop Suey in your browser if you'd like to. They worked with the company that made the game to allow access to that game. But anyway.
Yes.
We have a mic. Hang on.
Oh, Mike.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thanks for all that. Happy weekend, everybody. So just a quick question. So all the work that you're doing, collecting everything, kind of, scanning everything, what do you do with I was a little late, so if you covered this, I apologize. What do you do with everything that you have when you're done? And what about if you find like very rare things that are really valuable, and does it go to like another institution like the Smithsonian? Like, where does that happen? Like, you might find something that's worth like ka-ching a lot of money,
Right.
And what do you do with all that? Especially as gaming continues to evolve, and some of these rare things that people never thought would explode to the point where we are today. has a lot of just interest in terms of collectability.
Sure.
Does anyone ever want their stuff back? So.
That's fine. Okay, so to talk about what we do with the items, so the original copy of the game is still kept by the MBRS section down in Culpeper. So that's it's in an archival container. It's kept in archival conditions. So the original item is being preserved as well as possible. The digital copy goes into our digital preservation system. Up here on the hill, for digital copies of stuff, we use a system called CTS, which stands for Content Transfer System. That's like the most boring name ever. But it's our digital repository. Down in Culpeper, they've got a different system.
I mean, it's essentially our own digital repository, but that's what we're putting, all the work that Amanda does and sends down to us, we're ingesting those files into our digital repository. And that's where that final step of trying to describe the things in a way so that we know that we have that whole tree of both the game content and all the scans and everything. And so that all that stuff is being like kept together and put into
Right.
our repository.
So the digital collection is kept in archival conditions as well.
Right.
So as far as valuable stuff, I'm not a curator, so if something comes by that's super valuable, then I might geek out about it, but it's kept to the same levels of care as the rest of our collection. We try to make sure that we're taking care of the entire collection because we're America's library. So we're trying to make sure that we're taking care of everything like it was the most valuable thing we've ever come across, which is excellent. And we don't sell it. We don't give it to Smithsonian because they have their own stuff. We get to keep our stuff. And we would never. I don't know, well, never is always a harsh word. But if somebody gives us something, then there's a deed of gift. They're giving it to us, and we won't give it back because they gave it to us, or we bought it, or however we acquired it. It's ours now. And again, we're America's collection, so we're not in the business of selling stuff for profit. So I would say that I am hesitant to use the word never, but never. So again, we're going to just take care of it as well as we can. If it's very valuable and we figure out that it's really valuable, then we're probably going to highlight it and say, hey, come to the library. Look at this thing. It's awesome. And hopefully at some point we'll be able to say, come and play a copy of this thing on our emulated software or whatever.
I mean, like I foresee a time when in a room like this, there will be games sitting behind glass cases in the way that these violins and cellos are now.
I mean, they are. Go in the Coolidge after this. There's stuff
you
in
can
glass
see
cases.
In the display case, some of the valuable stuff. But I will also say that we don't use necessarily monetary value to determine what gets prioritized for preservation. Right now, we're just sort of saying it's more by format. So if it's a format that we're afraid is going to be subject to bit rot or something where we're not going to be able to get that copy off that disk anymore, that's more what's taking precedence over whether or not it's something that's worth a lot of money.
Yeah. Okay. Hello.
So you've addressed the question about prioritizing what's in your collection, but the bigger question, who makes the decisions about what kinds of collections you're going to go for? For example, beta videotape.
Right.
I mean, that didn't get replicated, or perhaps VHS that did get. I don't know. Who makes those decisions?
Well, in terms of, you're talking about video, so I can talk a little bit about that, but I can also apply it to video games as well. So essentially, it does come down to that. To the format and whether or not that format is endangered at all, So
It is endangered.
Yes, exactly. So so for the video in my building, which I also work with, we had to say, okay, we have 3/4 inch, we have beta, we have VHS. There's kind of a tree of how in danger each of those formats is. So we essentially approach it in that way. So we say, okay, well we better get all the 3/4 inch down first because that's the most at risk. And it's a similar thing with the video games as well.
What about code? Is it a similar thing for the code? I mean, if this machine is a Fortran and it's not running Fortran for 20 years, what are we going to do with all those cards?
Right.
I just work on what we've got. We do have a lot of divisions that are in charge of determining what we're going to get. And we have a recommended format statement that talks about what format we prefer and which formats we'll accept. which most things are acceptable. We'll accept pretty much anything, but there are things that we prefer if a particular film or whatever could be given in a digital cinema format versus beta versus 8-inch, you know, what I don't know, the different formats. I'm not a video person, sorry. I probably just mangled that. But we would prefer the higher res digital cinema package over something like that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we're like actively working on right now, especially, you know, as we're trying to make this transition towards getting more born digital materials. Because, I mean, you know, currently I can say, you know, we get a lot of material still, moving image material, even things that you would see on Netflix, things that like never really touch a physical thing. They're shot digitally, they are edited digitally, they are distributed to you digitally, and that's essentially it. But we're getting some of that stuff on DVD-R just because the mechanism isn't in place right now to send us those digital files directly.
You addressed working with the Smithsonian. What about working with other archives such as universities or the Internet Archive? Do you interface with them and say, what's in your collection and how are we going to keep one copy? Do you do that kind of stuff?
Yes.
Triage?
I wouldn't say for video games specifically, but for other formats, yes, we will look at other institutions, and if somebody else has already digitized something and made it available online via the Internet Archive, via HathiTrust, some of the other more widely available digital repositories, then we will not reformat that. We will preserve our original copy of something like a book or a newspaper, but we won't put together the resources to digitize that if somebody else has already done that work. So we're kind of collegial in that way. And we also work very closely with other institutions to figure out best practices and to figure out what we should be doing and talk as a community.
Sure.
Okay.
Guys, is there any other research being done in tandem
Can you talk into
with-
your microphone?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
I didn't want to get the feedback. Is there any other research being done in tandem with your research, Amanda, in regard to longevity of magnetic media? I mean, the joke on the internet is that it's basically they're man facts. Everybody says, well, how long does the data last on a 5 1/4 or a 3 1/2? And the guys on the internet just make these logical guesses. It would be wonderful to be able to just quickly document that information as the data backup is being done, in order to basically come up with facts along the lines of how long has data survived matched to, you know, the actual file date.
Sure.
And things like that. Is that being done?
So our preservation research and testing division, PRTD, does research on the physical carriers. I know they've done a study on different CDs and DVDs and optical carriers to see how long those actually last. And it's possible that they've done some research on floppy disk formats and stuff too. As far as us capturing data about failure rates and such, not systematically and not scientifically, but I will say anecdotally, I have higher failure rates with CDs and USB drives than I do with floppy disks. Because, and that might be an issue of scale, I see way more optical disks than I do floppy disks. But I feel like the floppies have held up a little bit better than some of the CDs, especially if the CDs were made by consumers rather than publishers. So if they were made in somebody's CD drive at home and then they put an adhesive label on the top, those are going to fail fast. And whenever I'm talking to our collections curators about prioritization, then that's usually what I say. I say, if you've got anything with like an adhesive label on the top, let's work on that first, because that's going to be our biggest trouble. If you've got anything on a hard drive that's just been sitting in a desk for 20 years, let's definitely work on that right now. And especially if you've got a USB key or whatever that can just disappear, let's get that off first, because you know where your floppy drives are, and they're probably where your floppy disks are, and they're probably going to hold up just a tiny bit better more than your more vulnerable CDs.
Hi. So I know that the Library of Congress does some of its own coding, like with Bagger and things like that, which is a great program. I love it. But you mentioned that you use some virtual machine programs, some open source ones like DOSBox. Has the Library of Congress considered contributing to code for those? Because I know development sometimes on those can stall a little bit.
Yes. For some projects, we do contribute. For some projects, we'll contribute financially and then say, hey, can y'all develop this particular aspect of it for us? And we'll kind of chip in for that. Sometimes we will basically take over a package that was open source and we'll make a library version of it that's maybe a little bit more robust. And it just kind of depends. I know if you're familiar with BitCurator, we're part of the BitCurator consortium. We are hopefully at some point going to be part of some sort of emulation solution and do the same thing with that. So, yes. Okay, and then there's a gentleman back here that's had his hand up. Thank you.
Let me get the kids.
Okay. Oh no, I'm.
No, it's okay.
I'm sorry.
I thought you wanted the kids to.
I mean, yeah, he can ask.
Okay. One second.
We'll come back to you. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Thank you.
What game were you guys the most excited to see?
Most excited to see? I was pretty excited to see that ET Atari game, I have to say, which is why I included it in the PowerPoint, just because, well, A, I'm like of the generation of people who like was totally into ET as a little kid, and so I was excited about that from that perspective. Yeah, I would say that like whenever we get like a gift collection of the older games, just because I grew up playing like any like original NES and stuff, I always get excited to see. So like Battletoads and some of those like Spy vs. Spy and some of the other kind of like rarer like NES cartridges I've been excited about.
Our pilot project that we worked on had the original Tetris.
Which is also on display.
You know, not only did I work on imaging that, but you know I had to test it and make sure it worked. So that was fun. And then we had Commander Keen, which is an old like platformer where you know you got a guy that jumps from platform to platform and stuff, and had to test that. You know, make sure it worked. So my boss comes by and he sees me playing video games, and I'm like, it's work. It's good.
So yeah, the Tetris that we have, and it's on display back here if you want to check it out. It's the Spectrum Holobyte version. So it was like it's pre-Game Boy, and it has all the actual like kind of Russian propaganda images like surrounding the. So it's pretty great.
Yeah.
Okay.
When you're cataloging video games, who are the people that you take into account as far as when you're deciding who the author is or the creator or who to list?
Right.
And you mentioned videos of gameplay. Do the folks who do the gameplay get credited?
So we actually haven't cataloged any of the videos. That is a very good question. We haven't cataloged any of the videos of gameplay yet. I don't think that we would. I don't think that we even have the information of who's doing that gameplay. I think it's just sent. You know, it's mainly sent from the publisher. It would be like whatever would be sent around, even for like for people to like write reviews of the game. So it's that kind of like promotional material. So it has like very little information right now in terms of cataloging, and any like personal or corporate names that we've included. We're mainly just including the companies that develop the games and publish the games, just because we want to be able to like bring all of that information in. We haven't quite gone deeper into the credits to talk about like actual individuals, but there are certainly games that I know of that I would say like, oh well, it's important for people to know that Sid Meier is involved in this game or whatever. If there are certainly names that I would want to bring out in that kind of context, but I just haven't had to do it yet. But thank you.
I know yesterday there was a copyright panel, and they were talking about this game called Breakout, and the copyright deposit was a video of gameplay. And the copyright office representative was talking about watching this video and just waiting for the guy who was playing the game, whoever was playing the game, to fail. And they didn't. So they were an expert at playing this game, but there's no indication about who was playing the game. That information wasn't captured by whoever submitted the copyright deposit. But that's a great thing to think about.
I would like to know who the people are playing the game for sure.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really great. My question is related. Actually, I was going to ask you about how and if you're documenting interactivity, how people are actually playing the game. Which, if I think about like future researcher access, not just about the content, but about how people are actually playing and building communities together, and how they work with consoles, that kind of
I would say having that, those collections of the gaming magazines is probably very contributory towards that, like documenting the culture surrounding video game production and consumerism. But we're not keeping that information with the digital copy of the game or with the cataloging information. But I think that would be something that would be a really interesting cultural study.
Yeah, but that is, and again, like it is another reason why we're trying to, why we keep all the strategy guides in our building, and why we try to image and scan all of the, the user manuals and everything that comes with the game, so that we do have that information, so that, if one day we are able to, to emulate a game, for example. I mean, you do, because you lose that in emulation, obviously. You lose, some of the functionality of how you actually interact with the game, but at least we'll have the scans and the original documentation that tells you, well, this is how, a user would have interacted with that. The gameplay videos are essentially literally just a screen capture of the game being played for like 20 or 30 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, to show how, like, basic elements, how the look and feel, how the sounds were, things like that.
Okay, so my question has to do with the metadata standards.
Okay.
So if you know anything about information science, as you guys do, that's a big debated topic, is the metadata standards.
Right.
Do you think that as part of, MARC 21 or MARC with the Library of Congress, that you guys will have your own set of metadata standards specifically for the video games, since you have so many of the different varieties worldwide, as well as different platforms? Would it benefit to have that separate standard?
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, so right now what we have to work with basically are those OLAC best practices, which use MARC and RDA. But that, they only go so far, and MARC really only goes so far. MARC only goes so far to describe moving images, which is what I spend the other half of my time doing, But there are rules specific to moving images, like AMIM2, that we can use that say, okay, well, if you have like a home movie, because it's not something that's published, this is how you would describe it, So yeah, I do think that we should eventually, at some point, I hope, work towards a very specific set of cataloging rules that speak specifically to video games. And I mean, hopefully by then we'll also be sort of out of the MARC, beyond MARC.
Maybe everything will be streamlined.
I know the University of Washington has an XML schema specifically for video games that they have developed or they are developing. So it's a fluid sort of thing that's coming up.
Yeah, there are quite a few projects in the works, that are trying to come up with like controlled vocabularies for game machines. Like I know they did a project at UC Santa Cruz and Stanford that was basically, the whole idea was to create this controlled vocabulary list of all the different kinds of things you might encounter. So there are all these different projects that I hope we can kind of coalesce into something that would be useful for people cataloging games, for sure.
I was at the talk here yesterday, and afterwards, one of the guys who was giving it told me they purge certain deposited items after 30 years for certain copyright receipts. Is that actually true?
I mean, they would know more than I would.
Yeah.
But I have a feeling it's probably true. I mean, we have only so much space. And I mean, I have a feeling a lot of those early copyright deposits that I showed you, I'm sure that they went to our warehouse in Landover and lived there for a time. And I mean, because I've asked about that Mario descriptive material and not been given a straight answer as to whether or not we still have it. So we probably don't.
And while on the same thing, do you two actually have the authority to view deposited items? Especially from long ago, where, say, the company doesn't exist anymore, the people who consigned it for deposit no longer are alive?
Somebody still holds the copyright. It depends on estate law and all that stuff.
Yeah.
If we have it on the shelves, we can view it. It's just a matter of being able to access it. As far as being able to serve it, we can still do that because it's the library's copy and it's library fair use. And if we can't publish it, we can't give it away, we can't, there's a lot of things that we can't do because of copyright, but if it's on our shelves, then we have a copy of it and we can use it.
So then you could check just to see even if you still have a deposited item from, say, 40 years ago, in some cases, for the really early stuff.
We have so much stuff here at the library. It would be a needle in a haystack, so there are people that are better suited to look for that stuff than I am. That's my political answer.
Yeah. And I mean, the issue with the game stuff is that, I mean, I think about it in the context of movie image, again, because I work for the movie image section. I mean, you know, for very early motion pictures, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, but we would get paper prints, which is basically an entire film printed out frame by frame on a roll of contact paper, you know, rolled up like a film reel. Right. So, you know, and those were kept in a locked room somewhere, I think, in the bowels of this very building for many decades before anyone even realized they were there. And only then did they realize how valuable those things were, because it meant that they could, you know, we now can scan high-res those paper prints frame by frame, output them either back onto film or in digital format, and we have access to things that are, you know, over 100 years old now. Better access to those things than we do to things that were made like 30 years ago, because, you know, because of the fact that we kept those paper prints. So I mean, my thinking is, and again, it kind of goes back to why I want to keep all this other contextual information and even the source code excerpts, even though they're excerpts, you know, because everything is a building block to knowledge of whatever format you're working with. So, I mean, as long as you keep, you know, anything, any shred that says this thing existed and this is what it was. I mean, I always use that paper print example because that's, I think, the ultimate example of how the library benefited from holding on to something, you know, that ended up being useful, but they didn't know how useful it would be, you know, in this modern era, basically.
Is that it? Yes. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, guys.